Hello, everyone. It's Shane Lynn at MacArthur Museum of Arkansas Military History. Today, we're continuing our Zoom interview series. I have Aaron Shuman. He's the Museum Experience Coordinator at the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas. He entered the history field after serving 6 years in the United States Air Force as a crew chief on C-130s. He was stationed for 4 of those years in Okinawa, Japan. After separating from the military in 2020, he entered the public history program at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. He also did an internship at Little Rock Central High National Historic Site. He was also an intern at the Clinton Presidential Library, and for us here at MacArthur Museum of Arkansas Military History. And so, Aaron, thank you so much for being here with us. Tell us a little bit about the National Museum of the Pacific War and a little bit what you do there.
Yeah, sure. Well, first off, thank you, Shane, for having me on, and it's good to see you again. I, like you said, work down at the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas. It's a small, little ethnically German town, really out in the hill country of Texas, not around any water. And so a lot of people wonder why we have the National Museum of the Pacific War so far from any kind of oceanic body of water. The answer to that is simple. It's a lot like your museum, where you're the birthplace of Douglas MacArthur. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, MacArthur's kind of counterpart in the Navy, was born in Fredericksburg. And the museum is kind of structured around the Nimitz Hotel, which his grandfather owned on Main Street of Fredericksburg. But our facility is quite large. It spans, I think, about 6 acres across Main Street in town. We have 4 or 5 different main attractions. Of course, the Nimitz Gallery in the Nimitz Hotel chronicles the life of Chester Nimitz. We have the George H.W. Bush Gallery, which is a fairly modern museum gallery that looks at the war in the Pacific more completely. That has almost 1,000 artifacts, including aircraft and tanks. And a really interesting one is the Japanese mini sub that was captured at Pearl Harbor during the initial attacks on December 7th. We also have our memorial courtyard, which is filled with bricks and plaques honoring those who served in the Pacific. We have a Japanese Garden of Peace, which was actually donated by the government of Japan. And we have the part of the museum where I work, which is called the Pacific Combat Zone. The Pacific Combat Zone has a couple exhibits, one on a TBM Avenger torpedo bomber, and we also have a PT boat. Those two, of course, if you think about it, you have the plane that George H.W. Bush flew in the war and the ship that John F. Kennedy was captain of. Not the exact ones, of course, because both of those were destroyed. But down the way from those 2 exhibits, we have the Living History Battlefield, which is my main thing. I run the Living History program there.
Awesome. Well, tell us a bit about the Living History program.
Yeah, so it's a big program. We perform on a battlefield, which is really unique. A lot of museums have a living history space, maybe an open field or an airstrip or something. We have a battlefield that has trenches, pillboxes. We have a Higgins boat that comes out on rails. We have military grade special effects that simulate bombs. And we run all kinds of equipment over that field, everything from a M3 Stuart tank that fires blanks to blank firing machine guns, Thompsons, M1 Garands, Arisakas, and my personal favorite is our M2-2 flamethrower that fires real live burning diesel on the battlefield. But we do 2 types of programs. We do outposts, which are quick 15-minute interpretive programs. And the other program is called Pride in the Pacific, which is our more battle program, runs about half an hour.
Awesome. I know that, for years and years, Civil War reenacting was very popular, but it seems in the last several years that World War II reenacting has gotten popular. Do you have any reenactments or folks that come in like that programs? I know you have folks who are volunteers that do that on a regular basis, but do you have any events for World War II reenactors?
So we do end up with a lot of people from the different eras of living history reenactment. It's actually really interesting. It seems like a pretty tight-knit community. The guys that go out and do the Civil War stuff are the same group of people that go out and do the World War II and the Vietnam kind of stuff. It just kind of depends on what they have. One of the advantages that we have at our program is that we provide all of the equipment. So whether that be weapons, blanks, uniforms, the whole everything, we provide it. So anybody can really come down and get involved. But we do go to a few different living history events every year. Just this last, I want to say October, we were in Houston at a place called George Ranch. They have a huge living history festival there. And there were World War II units, and there were Vietnam units, and European theater units, and people doing Civil War reenactment and Revolution, and just kind of across the board.
Awesome. Well, you know, we mentioned in your intro, in your bio, you graduated from University of Arkansas here in Little Rock. You also worked at Central High National Historic Site and National Park Service Site. You also worked at Clinton Library and for us. And those are some very different museum settings. How did that prepare you, or did it help you or prepare you for when you went to work there at the National Museum of Pacific War?
Well, I think a lot of those things are preparing me for the next steps for our living history program. Over the last year, we've been mostly focused on ensuring that the program is up to snuff from a safety perspective, making sure that everything's in place infrastructure-wise. Of course, we've been closed up since March of 2020 for living history shows because of the pandemic. So it's been just about 2 years since we had a real program. So there's a lot of things that needed to be fixed in the turnover. But looking forward, we're planning on really incorporating a lot of moving away from a show that's about booms and shooting and oohs and ahs, and going more towards education. And that, of course, requires a lot of research. So all the research that I was doing at the Clinton Library, at Central High, working at the MacArthur Museum, that's all going to end up being a really important skill.
And for the viewers who don't know, one of the programs, or one of the projects rather, you worked on here at the museum was to revamp our Allison photo collection to make it easier to assess when people went online with the photos and the captions, and did a really good job with that, and a lot of organization and keeping track of that, which I'm sure comes in handy, especially you shared with me earlier about your living history equipment and all that you were working to get organized and sessioned and things like that.
Yeah, I do actually keep track of a collection of about 4,000 or 5,000 items. And it's not quite the same scale. I want to say y'all have 22,000 items sitting in the basement down there, but it's a smaller collection, but a lot of the items are larger. I have 50 or 60 firearms, and we actually fire them. So, you know, it's not the same as, you know, you make sure it's dusted and kept in a dry environment. That's good enough. You actually have to take it apart and clean it and inspect for cracks and order new parts and make sure it's working properly. But yeah, the organization stuff that I learned working in the collections room there really carried over to this new position. It's something that my predecessor didn't have. That's one of the highlights I think people are seeing with me employed here.
Well, and then, you know, I shared earlier, you're a veteran of the United States Air Force. And so I'm sure that military background has to be an asset to you with just the firearms. But even though it's 75 years later, what you're dealing with from the military then to now, it still has to have be an asset to you.
Yeah, you know, with firearms, it's funny because Air Force. So it's not a whole lot of firearms training, but just from a safety perspective, you know, working on airplanes is all about safety, everything you do. I used to be an engine run supervisor, and that's you know, there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of things you have to be aware of, and it all has to be written down so that everybody understands the safety protocol. And that, I mean, working with our flamethrower, we're standing up the first ever written standard operating procedure for the operation of a flamethrower in the state of Texas. It's sitting up at the Texas Historical Commission right now, getting approved. Uh, just some interesting safety things that you run into. Operating a tank, what are your egress procedures, and what point do you need to have a spotter? Are you allowed to back it up on the battlefield during a show? These are all things that are really important to think about, that my military experience had me thinking about when I got there.
Right. I'm sure some of those same safety protocols that you're working on were already in place in the military. So
yes,
just sometimes when those of us in the museum field know when it comes to standard operating procedures and policies, there's sometimes a lot of cut and pasting from using other organizations and museums. But it's still important, valuable information, and safety certainly is #1 priority. Can you tell us about maybe some special programs or exhibits that you've got going on right now that's coming up?
Yeah, so they're running an exhibit right now. We have a temporary exhibit about the Philippines. Our curator went and collected, I want to say 25 items out of the collection that are not normally out on display, that had to do with the occupation, the battles for the Philippines, and just kind of use them to weave together a story of what life was like in the Philippines during the war. Of course, my big plug here is for Pride in the Pacific, which is making its return after 2 whole years. So on March 12th, there'll be 2 showings, and that's a paid program. It costs $10, but tickets are available online. Please come down and see us. Of course, there's also the Outpost programs, which will start back up on March 19th, 3 Saturdays a month. Those are free. But we also have a lot of roving digital programming. We do webinars once a month. We have a Day of Remembrance program coming up. We have just a lot of different things going on all the time. And I'm sure I can send you over the link so that we can put it in the description, but our events page has a complete calendar, and there's always something going on, even if you can't make it out to Fredericksburg.
Definitely, we will put that on the links page, but also, like anymore, the easiest thing to do is to Google National Museum of War in the Pacific, and that I think that actually I did that came on top. Your web page comes on top, which is a very nice web page that your museum has done. It's easy to navigate and find all kinds of great information. There is a tie between our museum and obviously your museum, and that would be this is where Douglas MacArthur was born, and of course you're doing War in the Pacific or World War II, so I'm sure he comes up in some of your exhibits as well, in some of your programs.
Yeah, of course. So as you know, Douglas MacArthur was the 5-star general of the Army in the Pacific, and Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz was the 5-star Fleet Admiral for the Navy in the Pacific. And the 2 of them ended up working pretty closely together to bring about victory. So MacArthur was put in charge of the South Pacific and Nimitz in the Central. Kind of a common misnomer is that Nimitz was in charge of the Navy and that MacArthur was in charge of the Army. They were actually separated geographically and in command. Each had elements of the other's service at their command during the war.
That's a great point. Thanks for bringing that up. A lot of people do get confused with that.
I didn't know it until I started. So, always catching up on that stuff. But in our gallery, then, of course, Douglas MacArthur plays a huge role. Any of the campaigns that were fought in the South Pacific, so you can imagine the Solomons or anything in New Guinea, of course, Luzon and Leyte, those are all MacArthur areas. So he plays really prominently there. I know our curator told me that we actually have one of his corncob pipes on loan from the Norfolk site down in our gallery. So yeah, he plays a very important role and kind of alongside Nimitz.
Right. Now, wasn't it true when the museum, I was trying to do a little bit of history, when the museum was first opened, it was sort of dedicated to Admiral Nimitz, correct? And then over the years it evolved?
Yeah, so initially the museum was housed entirely in the Nimitz Hotel. And the story that I've heard a few times, and I'll have to get fact checked on this because I'm still new here, but supposedly the city of Fredericksburg approached, or people from Fredericksburg approached Admiral Nimitz while he was still alive 3 times, asking him if they could make a museum bearing his name. And the first 2 times he said no. And the third time they asked if they could make a museum using his name, but honoring the men and women who served in the Pacific. And that was when he said yes. So the old museum was called the Admiral Nimitz Museum. And some of my older volunteers in Company K doing Living History who have been around the program for 30 plus years still call it the Nimitz. But I want to say in 2007 or 8, we kind of shifted over towards calling ourselves the National Museum of the Pacific War, which is more in line with our mission, which is to tell the story of the war and maintain its continued global relevance, which is hard to do if you're just focused on Admiral Nimitz. He's part of the story, but not the full.
Well, and it sounds like Admiral Nimitz, you're more in line with what Admiral Nimitz wanted. He didn't want about him. He wanted about people who served.
Yes.
So it's great that you're doing that. And you get over 10,000 visitors a year. That's quite a bit. And Fredericksburg is I've been through there. It's a nice community. It's a nice place. I hope people, now that the pandemic is starting to subside, and hope people will begin to visit places and museums again. And when they do, I hope one of the places is yours, because it is a very interesting museum. It does honor the veterans of World War II from the Pacific. I have to tell you, one of the neatest exhibits I think you have is the midget submarine that was at Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
And I read online, which was an interesting story, the gentleman who was captured was who became the first prisoner of war, Japanese prisoner of war. He came back a number of years later, and there was a dedication or ceremony.
Mm-hmm.
Which was,
yeah.
really
I've heard that story too. Just thinking about the what kind of imagery that had to have been.
Exactly.
To see him return to that piece of equipment so many years later. It was
right. Yes, definitely. And hopefully a period of healing for both sides.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much, Aaron, for being part of the program today, the interview. Thank you for the work that you do down there at the National Museum or the Pacific War, and keeping the memory of our veterans and our service members alive through their deeds. So good luck with all you've got going on, and I hope people will come down and visit you.
Yeah, me too. Thank you for having me on.
You bet.